am a speech language pathologist by clinical training. And after about 20 years of seeing people with Parkinson's disease almost exclusively in movement disorders, specialty clinics in 3 different countries, I decided it was time for me to go back and do a PhD for a couple of reasons. One, there were problems that I was seeing that current treatments were not addressing, and that were really frustrating for the people that I was working with and their families. And so I thought, well, gosh, I've got to go back and try to help find solutions, A, to understand the problem, and B, to think about interventions for addressing the problem. And the second reason I went back was because there were not enough in speech language pathologists or allied healthcare professionals that I felt like were really equipped for working with people who have Parkinson's disease and their families. And it just felt so sad to me that every time I would see someone in the clinic and we might send them out into the community for more therapy, that they basically got a swallowing assessment and maybe a speech assessment, and that was it. And we weren't really thinking very deeply around the interventions that needed to be made available for people with Parkinson's. And so I wanted to go back so that I could work at helping to train the community, so physical therapists, speech language pathologists, and whatnot in this area. And so that's what I've done. I finished my PhD. So this is actually, this is my silver jubilee. I celebrate 25 years of clinical practice this year. But I also am in about my 10th year of faculty. So I went back to do a PhD, and then which I did in Canada, which is I've practiced in the US, Canada, and UK, and then came back to Northwestern when I finished my postdoc. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, and I'll share the slides here in a minute, is a component of our research that focuses on communication breakdowns, not strictly speech breakdowns. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the talk. But we're really focusing on that dynamic of conversation. So what happens when you're trying to have a conversation with someone when those hus, ums, and whats come up? We're going to talk a little bit around how to minimize those, but also what to do when they happen, because part of that is just communicating. It's exaggerated a bit in Parkinson's disease. And the hope today is really to walk you through some really kind of concrete strategies that you can start to implement at home with your family. I'm going to try to, although I get very excited about these topics, even over Zoom, so you'll see that. I'm going to try to keep the talk to around 40 minutes or so, 35, 40 minutes, and that way there's lots of time for questions afterwards, so store those away. If I know the answer, I'll tell you. If I don't know the answer, I'll find it, and if I really don't know the answer, then I'll connect you with someone who does, and so I'm happy to do that. So let me share my screen to you, people with Parkinson's disease and your families, that the topics that we study are important. And important not just to organizations that fund Parkinson's research, but also important to the National Institutes of Health and other federal funding bodies. So I show this slide so that you know that the problems that are important to you are actually important to those who are providing dollars into research. And so every time you stop and think about, well, gosh, where do my taxes go? Are they helping my condition? They are. And where do my donations go? Are they helping my condition? They are. It's those very entities that fund research like the work that I do, as well as my colleagues. And so as we talked about, we kind of have 3 objectives for today. We want to talk about how these communication changes in Parkinson's disease, but also aging, affect everyday conversations. We're going to spend some time focusing on what are the signals of those challenges? How do we know when a conversation's not going right before it's too late to do anything about it? And what are some strategies for preventing or resolving those challenges? And then we're going to talk just ever so briefly around the impact. So what do these conversation difficulties do? Because it's much more than just not being able to get your message across. It's also about how we build relationships and how we preserve the dynamics that are so key and so critical as we travel the journey of Parkinson's disease, either as family members or as people living with PD. So as I alluded to at the beginning, this line of research for me really came out of clinical practice. And so I would be in the clinic every week, and the movement disorders neurologist and I would be doing the UPDRS. So we were looking how quickly you tapped your hands and how quickly you could move it when we stood you up, and could you hold your balance? And we were even looking at motor speech. So was your voice loud enough? Were the sounds clear enough? But people kept saying to me, it's more than that. I can't find the words I want to use. I can't get my thoughts to come out in a way that seems to be as organized as I would like for them to be. And care partners, people living with people who have Parkinson's disease, and other family members were saying, it's not that I just can't hear him, just sometimes I'm not understanding what's there. And over time, I just start to give up. I give up and I walk away because it's too hard. And I don't exactly know how to help my loved one. And so I'm not sure how to help us get past these points. And I went back and was looking, and there were no interventions. In fact, no one was even talking about these problems. We had some scattered studies, but in the literature, there's still really only about 3 or 4 studies that talk about this phenomenon, the phenomenon that exists outside of the motor impairments. And we know part of this is speech, part of this is quiet voice and sounds that maybe aren't as clear. We know part of it is cognition. So some of those early changes just in speed of processing and slight changes in memory that occur to a lot of people with Parkinson's disease, tip of the tongue phenomenon. So having the right word there, but not being able to retrieve it. And we know that the changes that we see in Parkinson's disease are a little bit different from those that we see in typical aging. And so that really, these types of comments, which are comments in these speech bubbles that actually came from my patients at the time, were things that drove me back to thinking about how do we study this in a more systematic way? And what are the real conversation problems, not just speech problems, but communication problems that we need to be addressing? So lots of communication changes have been documented in Parkinson's disease, and some of these you're really familiar with. If you live with Parkinson's disease or live with someone who has Parkinson's disease, you've probably seen and observed some of these behaviors. So the voice can get a bit quieter. People tend to pause more frequently, and they tend to pause in places that we don't expect. So as speakers, we pause in sentences between, for example, clause boundaries in sentences. So yes, grammar is linked to pausing. But people with Parkinson's disease might pause in places that aren't as predictable. We tend to see in Parkinson's disease, and we've shown this in our own work, that early on in the disease, we see subtle grammatical errors. So maybe dropping off a word ending or forgetting to put the plural S on the end of a word. We see trouble connecting thoughts, and we see increased behaviors in these moments that we call disfluent moments. They're not stuttering moments, but people with Parkinson's disease, more so than their age typical peers, would tend to have more episodes of starting a sentence and then having to revise that sentence, repeating sounds, maybe even repeating parts of a word. So today is a beautiful day. It sounds almost like a moment of stuttering, but it's not what we would think of as being classic stuttering. We also see that facial expressions change. So people with Parkinson's disease, as you know, sometimes may not use gestures in the same way to emphasize a message. They may not express their facial expressions in as animated a way. And we think about that as being sometimes what's called the masking of the facial expression in Parkinson's disease. So that's part of the motor symptoms. It's also part of a cognitive symptom of Parkinson's disease. People with PD have trouble not just only expressing those emotions, but also processing emotions. They may have more difficulty interpreting, for example, a happy tone of voice from a sad tone of voice. So we have all of this kind of large body of research on aspects of communication, and we normally get these from very well-controlled laboratory experiments of people watching videos or conveying stories. And what we didn't really know, though, were how do these things manifest in people's everyday lives? Are they really problematic? Or are they just things that we notice when we're in a lab and forcing people to do these unnatural tasks? So as part of our research, we set about starting to record conversations from in people's homes. So we wanted to take a look at whether or not people with Parkinson's disease, all of these challenges in terms of low voice volume and difficulty finding words, were they actually being manifest in the conversations that people were having at home? And were they impacting the quality of those conversations? And actually, how did people compensate around those? Do people learn how to get around those challenges, or do we see them really impacting communication? And so we started this study protocol where we went into people's homes and we recorded hours and hours of their conversation. We write it all down, we transcribe it meticulously, and then we try to analyze it for these things that we call conversation breakdowns. So a conversation breakdown is something like Susan described earlier on, where I'm saying something to you and that message doesn't come through quite clearly. In this example, let's go to the art show on Saturday, but what the listener actually hears is, why would we go to the cat show? And so that gets us to those huhs, whats, I didn't understand you moments in everyday conversation. Well, some of those are normal. That happens in my house. I'm sure it happens in everyone's house. So these misunderstandings, or what we call conversation breakdowns, are not atypical. They happen on a daily basis to all of us. They're part of human communication. What we see in people with Parkinson's disease is that they happen a lot more frequently, and they are more complex when they occur. And this is the space that we've been trying to understand. So it's a little bit of data from some of our studies, and I'm going to walk you through what's here. So I'm going to make scientists out of you for just a moment. So on this bottom scale where you've got these blue bars, think about those blue bars as being the percentage of all these trouble sources. So for us, a trouble source is when we observe in conversation that one of these breakdowns has occurred. So the message didn't get through as we intended it to. And we then code those for the reasons why that happened. Did it happen because the person with Parkinson's voice was too quiet? Something we might call a motor-based trouble source. So if the voice is quiet or the speech sound could not be understood. When we talk about these language form and content errors, those are errors where someone uses the incorrect word. So I meant to say shovel, but I said shoe. And that then causes the conversation to break down because the listener goes, gosh, that word doesn't make sense. I don't really know what my partner was saying. These turn management or topic management category, which you see here has the largest number of trouble sources. Those are times when the conversation just doesn't flow well. So I might be talking and then my partner starts to talk over me. We get a lot of that in Zoom and a lot of this in this kind of video interface. But it also happens pretty commonly in people who are living with Parkinson's disease, where they start to talk and their conversation partner talks over the top of them. And when that happens, it makes it hard for both parties to understand what's happening. And we often get one of these conversation breakdowns. These types of topic management changes, this kind of third bar, this really tall bar on the graph, is also another concern that we see, where people they start a topic, but then they change a topic and they might go back to that topic and flop to another topic. So we call that topic management, whether or not someone is staying focused on a topic or whether they're jumping all around. This little tiny category that we call environmental factors are things like background noise, right? So was it that the conversation broke down because there was a lot of background noise, a lawnmower going in the background? And then this very, very small category are just things that we couldn't put into a single box. So when you look at these trouble sources, and we've looked at them in great detail across these conversations, one of the first things that sticks out to us is that conversations break down in Parkinson's disease for reasons that are totally unrelated to sound clarity and voice loudness. In fact, very few of these breakdowns that are happening in conversation are actually happening because the person with Parkinson's disease is not loud enough or their speech is not clear enough. And this was incredibly important, right? Because up until this point in time, up until we started doing this research, the assumption was that 100%, at least 95% plus of the problems in Parkinson's disease relative to communication had to do with voice loudness and speech clarity. And so all the interventions, all the programs we developed were developed to address those two symptoms. But if addressing those two symptoms only takes care of about 10% of the reasons why conversations break down, then that's problematic. And this is indeed what we see in this research. Because people will finish a block of speech language therapy intervention, they'll finish Lee Silverman voice treatment or some other spectacular treatment that does great work on their voice loudness and their sound clarity, but they go home and they're still not satisfied with their overall communication ability. They're still having challenges at home, still having trouble in these conversations. But we needed evidence, right? We had to actually say something's broken in the system. Here's what's broken. And now that we have this evidence, we can move forward with thinking about interventions, and I'll share some of that work with you toward the end. So this is the same data. So the same exact data that I just showed you, only this time we broke it down a little bit differently. We broke it down into the purple bars, which are the conversation partners. So those are the people without Parkinson's disease, the family members in our study of people with Parkinson's disease. And the orange bars, which are the people with PD. And so we took these same conversations, we broke the data down to say, gosh, who's responsible when these trouble sources happen? Whose fault is it? Not that we really ascribe fault, but who's the person speaking when the conversation breaks down? Who's the source of the trouble? So not just what the source is, but who is the source? So if you are following this data correctly, what you'll see is that there are areas where the orange bars are taller than the purple bars. That means that these types of problems, like the clarity of speech problems and the use of the wrong word problems, tend to happen more so. The cause of those tend to more so happen with the person who has Parkinson's disease. But you see this column in the middle, this discourse and topic and turn management category of trouble sources. Overwhelmingly, the care partners are the source of these challenges. So this raised something else in the literature that we had not really been talking about, which is that both the person with PD and their family care partners contribute to these conversation changes. Together, they're causing these problems. So if all we're doing is treating, in air quotes, or addressing the problems in the person who has Parkinson's disease, and we're not including their care partners, their family members into those interventions, then we've not done a whole lot of good, because we're addressing part of the challenge, but we're not addressing the full challenge. And this is the place where I often say, no matter how many times I give these talks, and I've been doing this a long time, even before I was a faculty member, talking to communities is my first love. And people with Parkinson's disease, this is a point in time when if we're in a big auditorium, I start seeing all their head nods go up and down and up and down and up and down. And I start seeing them poke their partners to the side saying, see, it's not just me. And it's absolutely true. So for all the times that someone just looked at you and said, just be louder isn't the option, not the full option, nor is it the case that it's always the person with Parkinson's disease where these trouble sources emerge. So we think about this, and we've started to reframe interventions into what we call dyad-based interventions, where we're drawing in both the person with Parkinson's disease and their family care partners to understand how these conversations are breaking down and what do we need to do to make them better. So does that, I hope, was able to present that in kind of a clear enough way to drive home these 2 points. It's not just speech loudness, and it's not just the person with Parkinson's disease. So here's a very simple example of something we saw in one of these conversations. And so ignore our annotations here, but I'll walk you through kind of how we think about these data. Here, PD-S means the person with Parkinson's disease. CP is their communication partner. And this is exactly what they were saying to each other. So the person with Parkinson's disease struggles a little bit straight out of the gate to try to be clear in what he wants to say. And he said, he's told Ben not down quite. And his care partner clearly looks and goes, what? I didn't get that. And then the person with PD tries again. He says, the screw, he was told he could bend and make the screws will come out. And the care partner pauses for about 2 seconds and says, they're going to take them out. So she's trying to get closer to the message. The person with Parkinson's disease, picking up that she didn't understand, says, no, they could come out if you put too much weight on it. So he finally takes him a couple of tries, but he's able to get his thoughts organized and gets it out. And she goes, oh, I get it now. Oh yeah, they'll fail. So this is what we call kind of this complicated exchange of when the message doesn't come across through clearly the first time, how people have to negotiate that back and forth to try to get the message out. We call this, now you guys will all be signing out, I'll hire you in my lab. We call this kind of the trouble source repair sequence. So you have a trouble source, the message doesn't get across, and the dyad attempts to kind of repair. And it's this repair, this complexity of repair that we'll talk about here is a need for strategies. So at the end of the day, one of the things we've discovered is about 2/3 of all conversation breakdowns that happen in conversations that involve a person with Parkinson's disease and their family member are completely unrelated to speech clarity and voice. 2/3. And again, it drives home that very important point that if all we're doing is treating voice loudness and speech clarity, we're leaving a lot of the needed targets for addressing and communication unmet. Now, when I present these data often to my colleagues who are speech language pathologists and my neurology colleagues, they look up and go, no way, that's not true. When I present these, they are very true. When I present these data to patients and families, they totally get this, because inside, again, all we're doing here, nothing is inventing the wheel, right? We're not reinventing anything here. All we're doing is cultivating in science the exact phenomenon that people with Parkinson's disease and their families have known for some time. This isn't just a motor problem, and we need to do more. And what we're doing is putting data to that point so that we can start to really shift practice. So a minute ago, I was talking to you about conversation repair. So I showed you that kind of exchange about the screw and how when conversations break down, we try to fix them. And in fact, we are hardwired as human communicators to fix these breakdowns. We actually don't walk away from them. This is part of our evolutionary development. And this has been shown time and time again that it is an inherently human trait to repair conversation cycles when a misunderstanding occurs. In fact, we think this actually begins, part of where this skill begins is the exchange between a mother and an infant and a father and an infant at very, very young ages. So we are hardwired to just not let these miscommunications go. We have to try to fix them. And so lots of times we look at the reasons why they occur, but we don't always look at the repair cycle component of it. And we've been doing a bit of that in Parkinson's disease as well, to say, is it just that these happen more often and the trouble sources are more variable than we think? Or is it that the repair cycles are also impaired? And so here's an example of a repair cycle. I showed you one just a minute ago where, the care partner says, went by really quick, didn't it? The Parkinson's disease, and a person with Parkinson's disease says, yeah, it did, but they say it so quietly, their spouse couldn't hear them. Care partner says, huh? And he says, yeah, it went fast. Yeah, it did. So this is an excellent repair, right? It only took one turn. It's an efficient repair. So while the message didn't come through clearly the first time, they were able to repair it well. But here's an example of what we call a missed uptake, where the repair actually doesn't ever happen, where the care partner says something, and was there anything at Loblaws that we wanted? Now, for those of you who are, anyone who's familiar with Canada will know Loblaws is a grocery store chain in Canada. So that's where some of these data were collected. And the person with PD looks at his care partner because he didn't fully understand. And then the person with PD says, I can't remember what was on sale. So we have this kind of long delay in something that we tend to call a missed uptake, where it was so long that it's perhaps entirely possible that that conversation would have just been abandoned altogether. So we're looking at these repair cycles. We see challenges just like we saw in the trouble sources. We see that people in PD conversations, specifically more so care partners than the person with Parkinson's disease, tend to be much more likely to not pick up on the signals of breakdown. So these breakdowns occur, we need to repair it, we're hardwired to repair them, but what often happens is that those repairs don't happen. We know that the care partners of people with Parkinson's disease are actually much more likely to abandon repair attempts. So a message is misunderstood and they don't even jump in to try to clarify the message. And this is not a critique of care partners with Parkinson's disease. Don't take it as that. This is scientific observation. It's not a critique. But we actually see that those types of missed uptakes or failed repairs happen more commonly in Parkinson's disease than they do in Alzheimer's dementia, where this phenomenon is thought to be huge, right? So we've been studying conversation breakdowns in Alzheimer's dementia for years, but we actually see this kind of missed uptake, these abandoned opportunities to repair the conversation, this willingness to just let the conversation fall and fail and go to the wayside, much more commonly in PD conversations, even where there is no cognitive impairment, than we do in Alzheimer's dementia. And we know that the repairs are much more complex. They look much more like that first conversation I showed you about the screw, where it takes several tries to get at the right message. And again, that's different from what we see in Alzheimer's dementia, and it's different from what we see in typical conversations. So when we pull all this together, we're kind of thinking about the fact that these complex problems are not just complex in terms of how they initiate, but they are a product of both the person with Parkinson's disease and their care partner. There's likely some learned bad habits here. So not just that the conversations are tough, but that over the duration of living with the disease, that some bad habits develop in these conversations. And we've actually seen a little bit of that. We're working on some data now that I didn't have ready for today that shows that at the beginning of Parkinson's disease, when someone's first diagnosed and they're in the early stages, we don't see as many of these problems as we do over time. Now, that over time piece, one way you could say is, gosh, well, of course, the symptoms are getting more severe. Of course, it worsens over time. We see the conversations change and worsen even when the disease itself stays relatively stable. I'm going to repeat that. We see even when the disease stays relatively stable, the person is not getting more severe. Their motor symptoms are not getting more severe. Their cognition is staying the same. That these conversations become more impaired. And that's telling us a little bit around how living with Parkinson's disease and some of the challenges that emerge actually carry over into this conversation space, and how over time people can learn and develop these bad habits. So I'll touch briefly on speech and voice exercises, but I'm not going to spend as much time there. I'm happy to take questions at the end about this, but there's lots and lots of kind of discussion in the Parkinson's world around speech and voice exercise programs. Because certainly, as I said, one challenge here is a quiet voice and speech that isn't as clear. And so certainly we want to address speech and voice exercises. And still to date, this is the largest of interventions in speech language pathology, and they work. Early, targeted, and intensive voice training can actually, we think, possibly slow the progression of voice changes and reduction of voice loudness in people with Parkinson's. And we know that especially if the training is intensive, right? If just like those of you who are rock steady boxing and all the wonderful, the music therapy, all the wonderful programs you were doing today, that being intentional and intensive about this training can actually not just help the voice get better, but can actually change brain activity that's associated with voice production. So we've had research since the mid 2000s about that. So we know that these treatments work. We know that if they're done intensively, that they can alter how the brain functions relative to speech, and they can also slow down the progression. And two treatments that are really prominent in the literature are Lee Silverman voice treatment, so the LSVT treatment, so it's highly intensive exercise. And the second is a device-based intervention called Speech5, so another device that's really out and becoming more prominent in the literature, to where if you have trouble doing the high effort exercises, then wearing this device intentionally plays this sound that's louder than your voice whenever you're talking. So it takes advantage of a mechanism we call the Lombard effect, meaning that if your voice is quiet and I put a background noise that layers over your voice, then you're going to work as hard as you can to make your voice louder to talk above the background noise. So this is similar to what we call a cocktail party effect. If you're at a cocktail party, you work really hard to make your voice louder than the background noise that's at the party. So we can optimize this using a device for treatment purposes. And my colleague, Jessica Huber at Purdue, has done a lot of this work. And again, during the question period, I'm happy to take a few more questions about this if you're interested. And we also have voice amplifiers. So you can wear a voice amplifier that will help to make your voice louder in conversation. So that's another bit of a device approach. But where I really want to focus today, not because those other treatments aren't important, they're incredibly important and they work really well. But where I want to focus today on is in this area that turning up the voice volume may not be enough. And again, that comes out of this research that we've been showing that it isn't really voice loudness that's driving the majority of these conversation breakdowns. So we're going to spend a little bit of time touching base on a couple of strategies that we've been working with that are not necessarily novel to speech language pathology, but how we've packaged them for people with Parkinson's disease in this intervention that we call restructuring conversations. And when we think about restructuring conversations, we really have two goals. The first goal is to reduce those conversation breakdowns, so to lessen those instances where misunderstandings occur. We just want to reduce those down to as few opportunities as possible. But when they occur, because they will occur, then the second half of this treatment is about trying to make the repair cycle that we talked about as being more effective and more efficient. So we want to reduce those breakdowns, but when they occur, we want that repair cycle to be more effective and more efficient so that people don't walk away from conversations, so that people aren't sitting there saying, gosh, I don't even have the effort to try anymore. Or that we don't find people with Parkinson's disease stepping away from social engagement altogether, saying it's just too hard to try. It's just too hard. I try, and by the time I get ready to say what I want to say, the conversation's moved on without me, and it's just too hard to try. So I'm just going to sit back and listen. And that's not what we want. So we designed this program to address those two goals: reduce the number of breakdowns, and that when they occur, increase the effectiveness of the repairs. And one guiding principle to this intervention is we think about making sure that we align everyone's expectations with abilities and motivations. Now, this sounds very like, something I drew off a poster that's in a gym. And that's, the sentiment is similar to that. But I want you to read a little bit more deeply into this. The expectations have to match the abilities and motivations. So this was key for us because for Parkinson's disease, which changes progressively over time, we were trying to create a dynamic program that would train people with Parkinson's disease and their care partners to think about this as a dynamic event, that whatever strategies they learn today, they might have to adapt tomorrow, 6 months from now, and 6 years from now, that they were always trying to align these expectations around communication with the abilities and motivations of everyone who was involved. So that we had a program that would allow people for not just to be good for stage 2 disease or stage 1 disease, but all the way out to the later stages of Parkinson's disease. And you might say, well, gosh, that's a no-brainer. Yeah, it is. I agree. It's pretty much a no-brainer. But here's another piece of data that I will present to you. So in a paper that we have coming out in Parkinsonism and related disorders, we looked at roughly 5,000 patients around the world with Parkinson's disease. They were all being treated in specialty clinics, so very, very, well-established Parkinson's disease expert disease centers. When we looked at those data across all stages of Parkinson's disease, only 6% of people were referred for speech language pathology services. So let me say that again. Only 6% of people have been referred to speech language pathology services. Now contrast that with the fact that 90% of people with Parkinson's disease at some point in time in their disease are going to develop problems with communication. But even in these expert care centers, which have access to speech language pathology services, only 6% were referred. That contrasts with roughly 60% who have been referred to physical therapy services. So that says something's wrong here, right? Of those that had been referred, the majority of them were early stage disease, stage 1 and 2. So the other problems that we have in Parkinson's disease is that we really don't have any interventions for communication or for speech that go beyond that very early mid-stage disease. And so part of what we were trying to create here was to ensure that whatever intervention program we developed would be good at day 1 of disease and would be equally good in the more advanced stages of the disease. So I'm going to tell you some of the strategies that we use in our program. So you're going to get the Whirlwind 101 tour. But I will tell you the way that we do this is not just handing people over strategies. We do about 10 weeks of therapy, 1 session per week, with the care partner and with the person who has Parkinson's disease. We have a similar program that we run in Alzheimer's dementia as well. And so we work for about 60 to 75 minutes each session, practicing strategies that seem to be strategies that are well aligned and personalized to the types of communication breakdowns that a dyad is experiencing or the person with PD and their family member are experiencing. So I'm going to give you all these strategies, but in no way, shape, or form would I ever expect that you could just take them home and say, gosh, they're going to work instantly tomorrow. Because we find there's a couple of keys with this. People need to practice using these. They need experience practicing and getting feedback on how they're working and not working. The second thing that's key here is people, both the person with Parkinson's disease and their family members, have to learn when is the best time to put these strategies in place and how do I know when one of them is needed. And those two things, the extra practice and confidence, and then knowing what to use when, is why it takes us 10 weeks to do this training. But I'm going to go over some of these with you and hope that you find them helpful today. So one of the first things that we try to train people to do is to be in tune with yourself, your partner, and the environment. Keep in mind, this isn't just the person with Parkinson's disease, this is they and their family members. And we talk about this in a temporal, emotional, and cognitive space, right? So choose the time of day to have important conversations wisely. Don't try to have an important conversation about having the roof repaired when someone is on the low stage of their medication and they're tired. It just won't work well. So thinking about the best time of day and selecting that carefully when people aren't as tired, choosing it around medication times. We talk about the emotional attunement here is to check in on your own emotions as well as monitor your partner's emotions. Look for signs that someone's withdrawing. Look for signs that maybe they're more confused in the conversation, and this is true for both partners. Monitor for signals that someone looks overwhelmed, and you might need to slow down the conversation. You might need to repeat what you just said. This is one of the greatest challenges of even being in this type of environment. I'm so glad to be here with you today, but I miss not being able to see your faces. I miss not knowing if I need to slow down or repeat or what you got or what you didn't get. That loss of that kind of connection with the audience when you've got your slides in front of you and I can't see you makes me lose that emotional connection, right? And that makes it more challenging. And the same thing happens in one-on-one conversations at home, right? Being in tune with that emotional aspect is key. And then always thinking about the cognition or the intent. We like to remind people that conversation is for communicating, not testing. Conversation should not be about you testing your partner on whether or not they remember what day of the week it is, on whether or not they remembered their chore list from yesterday, or whether or not you're intentionally challenging them to make their voice louder, right? Conversation, if you're practicing voice loudness using conversation, that's fine. But everyday conversation is about connecting with that person who's in your life. It's about creating and establishing a relationship. It's about maintaining a relationship. And for that, the message doesn't have to always be perfect, but the connecting does. And so we try to tell people to focus on transactional and interactional conversations. Transactional are those conversations where you have to get a point across. I need you to take the garbage out. That's a transactional conversation. But in an interactional conversation, it's okay for the words not to be perfect. That conversation that's just about connecting with that person who's with you, whether it's a friend, a grandchild, a spouse, it doesn't matter. And then sometimes it's okay to let the message slide a bit, but knowing which one of those conversations you're having is really important. And to remember that it is always about communicating, not necessarily testing. We, in our program, work on teaching people to be respectful and to serve as scaffolds for their partner's success. So we teach couples how to have conversations around requesting permission. So again, if your spouse is having trouble getting a word out, you don't necessarily get the right automatically to jump in and fill that word. These are things we ask couples to talk about beforehand. Are you okay when we go to the dinner party tonight? If you get stuck on a word, can I fill that in for you? Are you all right if I do that? And these negotiations should happen on kind of an event by event basis. It's incredibly important so that the person with Parkinson's disease knows that he or she is still in control of their own communication. It preserves their sense of agency and personhood and does wonders for aiding in kind of the establishment and maintaining of good communication habits. We teach family members this important trick around learning how to be a ramp, to create room in the conversation for the person with Parkinson's disease. So one of the challenges with PD is it just takes more time to respond. It takes more time to organize one's thoughts and to get them out in a clear way. That notion of by the time I get ready to say what I want to say, the conversation's moved on. It's not just the planning, but it's also the listening and processing. And the more speakers there are in a room, the more talkers there are in the conversation, the harder this is. So we train family members how to delicately open up room in the conversation to buy extra time for the person with Parkinson's disease, right? So even saying, gosh, Susan had this great idea last week when we were talking about making our Thanksgiving dinner. Susan, do you want to tell them about the idea you had for brining the turkey first? Right? So your partner knows that conversation that you had. And while she's buying time for you, it gives you a chance to pull together your own thoughts and say, yeah, I saw this great recipe for brining it with juniper berries, right? But she's watching you. She's understanding that you need more time, and she's opening up in a very natural way. She's scaffolding to give you the opportunity to come in. And this is a very delicate skill to be developed. It's not something we're naturally born with. It's something we really focus on in this program as a way of helping to ensure that when you are in larger conversations with other people, that both of you have the chance to assert your place in that conversation equally. We have people focus on validating their partner's experiences. So your job is not to communicate for your partner. Your job is to acknowledge their conversation difficulties and successes, as well as their expertise and their perspective. You want to validate the feelings of your partner when failures occur, and don't blame. This is never about the Parkinson's disease, and it's not that your partner isn't wanting to be loud enough or isn't wanting to talk clearly enough or isn't wanting to find the right word. That's not what this is about. It's about saying, I understand this is hard for you. And likewise, if you're the person who has Parkinson's disease, occasionally it's about reaching out and saying, I understand that sometimes it's hard to understand my speech, but I'm trying and I'm going to work a little bit harder at it, right? Or next time I'm going to take a nap before we go out so that I know my voice will be strong. So these all seem like just kind of natural in a way. You could say, well, gosh, isn't that just someone kind of like a counseling approach? It is, but we as speech language pathologists are about optimizing communication. And all of these things operate in the periphery and they don't happen automatically. In fact, these are the things that we think are eroding as people live with Parkinson's disease. These natural, innate kind of conversation patterns that people have start to break down. And it's these very skills that if we don't address them, means that these programs are not as effective. And I'll tell you briefly, we have been developing this intervention for 8 years now, 8 years. On average, it takes about 12 years before an intervention goes from the first stage of development all the way into clinical practice. And we've done multiple variations of this intervention. When we just did basic strategies, some of the things I'm going to show you here in just a minute, and we did not address these aspects of focusing and validating and choosing temporal alignment and focusing on opening up room in the conversation, when we did not have those components in the program failed miserably, just failed. It was only when we added these components that we started to see real changes in communication patterns, quality of life, and a reduction in caregiver burden. This isn't just about getting the message across. When we do this program, we actually see significant reductions in perceived caregiver burden and increases in the person with Parkinson's disease's perceived quality of life. It's not just about their speech and language. And so we know that this is key to the components of the program itself. So a couple of just other little helpful hints, and then I'll wrap us up here so we have lots of time for questions. So you want to make sure that you're minimizing environment distractions, that you're turning off televisions and radios, and that you're getting someone's attention before you talk to them. You want to make sure this important key piece of providing additional time. Always provide additional time. Present information in smaller chunks. Give extra time to respond, and avoid rushing or having important conversations during hurried moments. And even though I'm speeding up now, I recognize that's not ideal, but I do want to make sure we get question time. This notion of topic management. So maintaining one topic until we're all the way finished. So I talked earlier in those sources of those trouble sources behind conversation breakdowns that this is one that we see a lot is people just jumping topics. It's super important to not change topics quickly, to give someone time to adjust to the next topic before you introduce. So if you're saying, gosh, we're going to the grocery store and then we're going to go outside and plant bulbs today, then you want to give a little bit of space and time before changing those topics so everyone can catch up, both in their processing of the information as well as in planning and selecting what they want to say next. If you are living with someone or you are a person who has a bit of dementia associated with Parkinson's disease, that can happen, then we actually recommend kind of simplifying some of the language. So this is we do this more in advanced disease. Everything I've shown you to date is important for early versus advanced stage disease. And we're thinking about advanced disease and we start actually changing the structure of sentences to make them simpler. We teach people to use more familiar words that are more common in everyday language so that you reduce the cognitive ability required to actually process and retrieve those words. And then we even teach people how to use things like simple yes, no questions. So we wouldn't teach this in early to middle stage, but we would certainly advance these techniques in more advanced stage disease. I want to give just a brief nod here to hearing loss. So hearing loss is actually incredibly common in anyone who's over the age of 55. It's the third most common health condition in people over the age of 55. And even if you don't think you have hearing loss, there's probably a good chance that you do have mild hearing loss if you're over that age. But hearing loss is actually more common in people with Parkinson's disease than it is in their age-matched peers. And we now have a couple of studies that have come out to show we don't understand why. So we don't understand why this is. But we do know that people with Parkinson's disease are more likely to experience hearing loss than people who don't have Parkinson's disease. And so hearing loss is also another common source of these conversation breakdowns. And so as part of our program, and we're trying to get neurologists to follow this the same way. We're trying to urge and encourage hearing tests for everyone who has Parkinson's disease and their family members, because this is treatable. We can do something about this. We can't change Parkinson's disease, but we can adapt around hearing loss. And so I just always put a plug in for the fact that if you know you have a hearing issue or if you have not been tested, this might be something to think about if you're having challenges with communication at home. I've got 3 more slides and then we'll kind of wrap up, but I want to cover some what not to do's. And this is on the repairing side. So we talked about all the strategies of how to set up a conversation maybe differently and things you can do during the conversation. But these are the real what not to do's. Don't raise your voice. Being louder does not help. If you're the person with Parkinson's disease, and yes, trying to be louder can be a bit more helpful. But if you're the person listening to someone, when you repeat what you have to say, don't raise your voice. All that does is make your partner feel as if they've done something wrong, and it actually makes them retreat back. We try to advise people, even though I gave you lots of examples of where this happens, that non-specific clarifying prompts of what, huh, and a do not work well at all. And we know this. All of the studies that we have done in our lab show that this does not work well. Instead, say, I didn't understand the last word that you said. Or did you say cat show or hat show? So actually ask for specific clarification. Because when you say what, huh, and the other person in I have to pull my Canadian side out. And when you say what, huh, and the person on the other side is left saying what, huh? I don't know what you want me to repeat. I don't know what you didn't understand. And so those non-specific clarification prompts are really kind of a bad habit, and we try to get rid of those as much as possible. You don't want to excessively reduce speech rate. So slowing down your rate to an excessive degree actually impairs understanding. It does not help understanding. And most importantly, you don't want to give up or abandon the chance to clarify your message. Stick it out. Don't walk away. We have some absolutely heartbreaking videos in the data we've collected in people's homes where the family members turn to us, shrug their shoulders, put their head down, and walk completely out of the room. And this happens a lot in conversations. And we would encourage people to continue to try to stick those out. If you absolutely get to a breaking point and you cannot understand what each other want, or the message just can't get across, then agree to drop it, but agree to come back to it. Conversation and communication are the ways that the whole definition of a conversation is not getting a message across. But the actual definition of a conversation is the primary mechanism by which we as humans establish, create, maintain relationships. So when you're abandoning that conversation turn and not coming back to it, it can do, and we have evidence to suggest this over the last 40 years of research, it can do harm to the relationship itself. We encourage people, again, to monitor for these signals of conversation breakdowns. And as I said, part of what we have to do in the treatment program is train this intentionally. It's not just something we can say, watch for signs of conversation breakdowns. Because when you're having a conversation and you're focusing on what the other person is saying and you're thinking about what you're saying, it's hard to do. So we actually teach people, we spend a lot of time, in fact, in the program, teaching people how to monitor for these signals. You want to verify that you understood a message correctly. And it's A-okay to ask for direct help. I don't think I understood you. Please repeat that again. Did you mean to say dog? Or did you mean to say today's a nice day? It is A-okay to make that direct request. You want to repeat, rephrase, show what you mean, and above all else, stay calm. Because staying calm will get you through a lot of these challenges. And it's, again, a component that we work on quite a bit in our research group, is teaching people how to stay calm when these moments are really distressing. So then lastly, conversations, this reminder as we wrap up, that conversations are about the responsibility of both partners. Conversation skills can be developed with practice. It requires flexibility. And everyone has to shift, not just the person with Parkinson's disease, but also their conversation partners. And it's about the most important component here is remembering that interaction is as important as transaction, that preserving a sense of self, emotional connections with other people, and reducing burden of activities of daily living make all the work that goes into trying to preserve these conversation skills absolutely critical. And then lastly, I do have to do a shameless plug because we are so incredibly grateful for the people like you and others who make this research possible. And again, if you're ever interested in participating in our studies, just let me know. I'm in Chicago, but we actually have the majority of our research studies now that can be done virtually and over Zoom. And so we're happy to kind of take people from all over the country. In fact, we commonly do. So if you're ever interested in participating in any of our research, let me know. Super happy to take any questions that you all have.
My wife and I, this last year has been really hard. It's been probably the hardest year. COVID hasn't helped at all, but it's been a very hard year for us with our communication skills that we used to have. So I'm really intrigued by this 10-week course, and I want to learn about how we could both participate in that course. Is that something we can do through Zoom here in Florida with you folks, or do I have to find somebody local in Florida?
Yeah, thanks, Roger, for that question. And you're absolutely right. COVID hasn't helped any of us, right? And communicating this way is challenging and adds stress, adds layers of stress, right? So we are early in 2021. So early in January, we will be launching another round of our intervention, and it can be done through Zoom. We can do it virtually. So reach out to me. We actually have the adapted protocol in with our Office of Research now, because they have to approve those adaptations. We're expecting that back any day. And then we look for starting people in the new year. So reach out, and for sure, if there's a way, if we can make it all work out, then we will definitely be there to support you. So not an issue.
So just send you an email then?
Yeah, send me an email. So I'll circulate the slides, and on the last slide has my lab's email account, also has our phone number. Susan has my email. Susan's welcome to send it out to you guys as well. And then someone asked a question around the use of sign language, and that's a really great question. Is there any research on the use of sign language, and is that helpful? Here's a couple of things we don't know, right? And we don't know this even in conditions like stroke or traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's disease, and certainly not Parkinson's disease. We're not sure exactly how those diseases affect the ability to communicate through sign. Certainly signing is a language, right? And so when we see language changes, we would also expect then languages like sign language to be impaired. But they do, even in terms of how sign language is organized compared to an oral language, they are organized somewhat differently in the brain. So this is actually an area we've had some interest in just thinking about not just gestural expression, because gesture isn't just kind of forming the gesture, forming the sign. There actually is that kind of linguistic cognitive connection to the representation of the concept or the representation of the word that goes with that sign. But sign language, if you know it and you have the a kind of proficiency in it, there's no reason why it shouldn't also be useful in this conversation context.
Dr. Roberts, can I ask you a question?
Yes,
Is there a way, so is there a way to combine like the intervention that a caregiver would need with a speech program, like a stuff like, loud and all that? Because to me, it almost feels like it should be hand in hand when they're doing.
So we agree with you. So the way, I think some of the newer kind of PD voice project programs are trying to start to combine some of these more communication based strategies with also voice interventions. This is the hard thing, and I face this a lot. We in our lab, we have a patient advisory council who works with us very closely and guides us on all of our science. So my student projects, our science really grows out of their focus. And my PCAC is often fond of reminding us, and please pardon the language, I know this is recorded, science is too damn slow, right? And there's a truth to that. Science can be really slow. So that is, I would say, Mark's words, not my words. Those are his words, right? We're just too slow. But it's a struggle here, right? So this notion of trying to get to like an LSVT plus or a voice therapy plus this, and really trying to establish its efficacy, right? Separate from our program on its own or LSVT on its own, it's a tough one, because first you have to go through the stages of proving they each work. Well, we know LSVT works. We're close to proving this works. And then you have to do these intentional trials around combining the two and seeing, do they work versus this one? And that's so unfortunate, because as a person with PD or a family member, by gosh, you just want something that works. If it's working for you, that's fine. But for us, the intentionality of the science has to be done so methodically, or else we can't get insurance companies to cover this, which means that if you have private pay, you can get access to these interventions. But if you're someone who doesn't have as many resources, then you don't have access, right? And so science is slow for that reason, because of the constraints on us to absolutely prove that something does or does not work, so that insurance companies will pay for it and otherwise. So I think it's a great point, Susan. I think it's spot on. I think it's the direction we need to go next. I think it is where we will go next, but we haven't been there yet for the sole purpose of just needing to be very methodical in the stages of development. It's also really expensive to do this work. So a full-on clinical trial, we have a telehealth trial now in another area, so primary progressive aphasia, which is another form of dementia. And so that trial in and of itself, for a 5-year randomized controlled trial, which is a phase 3 trial, which gets us close to being able to get out into the community, is $3.5 million to do it well for 90 people. So these trials are expensive, and then our ability to get grants and stuff makes it tough. So that's not an excuse making, and it's not even intended to be a justification. It's wrong, right? And I understand their frustration, but it's to explain why sometimes you see these things in parallel. So why we might be doing this very systematic science and agreeing fully with what you're saying, but knowing that that may be the next step for us.
I have another question. What do you do about mumbling?
So there are a few things that we can do around that. So, intentionally, again, in this conversation context, kind of working on how do you in those moments try to shape the conversation so that you're getting the most out of it. So some of these strategies, but they also is also reminding your partner of there are pacing strategies that can work here a little bit. That you can use during conversation. So sometimes if we have people tap on a table while they're talking, it actually helps to slow that pace down. So then you don't get that stumbling up effect. There are other ways that we can practice in conversation of just helping people to intentionally think about opening their mouth wider. So again, that notion of if I'm open, then I can't be fast. And so if we work with people to just kind of even open their mouth wider when they're talking, right? But the problem is in Parkinson's disease is my perception of how big is distorted, right? And so you have to actually teach them how to get unnaturally larger because their set mode is to be smaller. So there are things that can be done for sure. Again, like with all things, it takes time and patience and practice, and then we'll still take some work from the care partner to kind of cue and conversation, but there are a few things that can be done.
And thank you so
Thank you.
much. It was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.